So, what if the very structures built to connect you to the divine are um, actually acting as spiritual malware?
Like actively blocking the signal.
Exactly, actively blocking it. Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we're looking at something that really challenges how we view belief systems. Because, we usually think about our belief systems as these really rigid blueprints.
Right, like a schematic for a house.
Yeah, with right angles, load-bearing walls, perfectly calculated stresses. And I'm thrilled to have our resident expert here with me today to break this all down.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to get into this one. It's a heavy topic.
It really is, because we just assume that spiritual architecture has to be built a certain way or, the roof literally caves in. But what happens when you take that desire for strict external architecture and try to force the human soul inside of it?
Yeah, that's the core tension.
Today, we are bringing you along on a deep dive into a collection of sources that argue our accepted spiritual blueprints are, well, they're not just flawed, they are completely backwards.
Completely inverted.
Yeah. We're looking at excerpts from this really provocative manifesto-style website called Jesus Raw, and we paired that with a really fascinating, completely unfiltered audio recording of a conversation between two individuals who are basically dissecting the very foundations of theology.
And I mean, these sources, they're presenting a deeply disruptive perspective on faith.
Disruptive is a great word for it.
Yeah, they are not merely suggesting we rearrange the furniture in the modern church. They are making a case for demolishing the house entirely.
Tearing it down to the studs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because their focus isn't solely on the doctrines people are taught to believe. It's really on the precise mechanics of how the human mind and soul are actually structured to receive truth.
So they view the current religious infrastructure as fundamentally incompatible with the human spirit.
Right. Completely incompatible.
So the mission of this deep dive is to explore this radical anti-institutional framework. These sources are attempting to strip away centuries of tradition. I mean, they view organized religious structures quite literally as a spiritual virus.
A virus that you have to eradicate.
Yeah, and they advocate for this highly personalized, raw, totally unmediated connection with the divine. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to even begin to understand their intense critique of modern religion, we first have to look at their foundational redefinition of who God is.
Right, and what they believe the original intention actually was.
Which is wild.
It really is. It requires a complete paradigm shift from the way institutions historically frame the narrative.
So where do they start?
Well, the Jesus Raw Manifesto launches with this core, uncompromising claim, which is that Jesus did not come to start a religion.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, they point directly to Matthew 10:34, where Jesus states he did not come to bring peace, but a sword.
But they don't mean a literal sword, right?
No. In their framework, that sword isn't about physical violence at all. It's about severing ties with institutional control.
Ah, I see.
The idea is that he came to shake foundations, to break the chains of religious legalism.
And to basically dismantle the systems that try to act as a middleman between humanity and the divine.
Exactly. No more middlemen.
And the way they frame this relationship is striking. They pose this very direct question asking, what if God is more lover than lawyer?
That is such a fascinating distinction.
Right. Think about the psychological weight of that shift for a second for you, the listener. If God is a lawyer, you are living your entire life under this microscopic ledger.
Just terrified of doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. You are waking up every day anxious about your spiritual compliance, constantly terrified of violating some contractual clause that you might not even fully understand.
And that constant anxiety is exactly what the sources argue institutions feed on.
Because it keeps people coming back.
Right. In a legalistic framework, the burden is always on maintaining your status through external rule following.
Checking boxes.
Exactly. But in a romantic framework, the metric changes completely. You aren't evaluating your legal compliance anymore. You are evaluating the depth of your surrender.
Which is a huge difference.
It really moves the pressure from the external world of performing rituals to the internal world of the heart.
Which brings up a fascinating point they make about the Greek word for faith, which is pisteo.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
Mine too. Because growing up, I always heard faith defined as simply believing that something is true. Like just having unquestioning belief in a set of historical facts.
Right, just intellectually agreeing with it.
Exactly. But these sources point out a pretty massive logical flaw in that definition. They say, look at Adam and Eve, or even Satan. They don't have a problem believing in God.
None at all.
They all know for a fact that God exists.
Yeah, belief isn't the hurdle there. Knowing a fact does not transform a person.
So how do they redefine it?
Well, the sources argue that pisteo is much better understood in its original context as allowing yourself to be persuaded.
Allowing yourself to be persuaded, that's so much more passive in a good way.
Yeah, it's a mechanism of alluring. It's God quenching the fire of human rebellion and stubbornness, but not by banging a gavel and demanding obedience.
Right, not the lawyer.
Exactly. It's by persuading the individual to voluntarily lay down their arms and basically say, yes, let your will be done.
So wait, if we're moving from a legal framework to a romantic one, is this approach basically taking the ultimate legal contract of human history, all those rigid, ancient rules of religion, and running it through a paper shredder to reveal a love letter hidden underneath?
That is a great analogy.
Because they reframe the entire Bible through this lens. They describe it as a marriage between heaven, which they characterize as masculine, and earth as feminine.
From the very beginning to the very end.
Yeah, from Adam and Eve to Israel and Jehovah to Christ and his bride. They say it all ends in this ultimate dance of union. How does this shift from legalism to romance actually change the psychological burden on a believer, though?
What's fascinating here is how they trace this romantic framework all the way down to the linguistics of human psychology, specifically looking at the Greek word for conscience.
Okay, the conscience.
Yeah. It literally translates to see together with.
Oh, wow, to see together with.
Yeah, so when you strip away the legalism, the conscience is no longer this adversarial judge sitting in your head just waiting for you to mess up so it can hit you with guilt and shame.
The lawyer in your brain.
Right, the inner lawyer's gone. Instead, it becomes a point of collaborative union. It's a shared vision with the divine.
A shared vision.
What is the human spirit and the divine spirit looking out of the world through the exact same set of eyes.
That fundamentally changes how you navigate your daily decisions. But if that is the end goal, this romantic shared vision with the lover God, how do these sources claim we actually achieve that connection?
Because it's not easy, right?
Right. A love affair of that magnitude requires a specific kind of internal wiring, which leads us into their mapping of the human soul. And they use these incredibly intricate original acronyms to explain the architecture of how we connect and, how we fail to connect.
They do love their acronyms.
Yeah.
And they ground this mapping in a powerful metaphor from the Old Testament, which is the Ark of the Covenant.
Okay, so paint the picture for us.
So they focus on the physical construction of the Ark. It was made of gopher wood, but it was completely covered, inside and out, with pure gold.
With the wood representing the fragile, mortal state of humanity, right?
Yes.
And the gold representing the eternal nature of the divine.
Exactly. That combination represents the spirit inside a person, the divine overlaying the human. But the true architecture of the soul, according to their framework, is represented by what was kept inside that ark.
Right, the contents.
And they map those three sacred items directly to human spiritual mechanics using the acronym CUP.
Okay, let me see if I can track with this because the mechanism here is crucial. The C in CUP stands for conscience.
Right.
And they map this to the tablets of Moses, the Ten Commandments, which were kept inside the ark. So the conscience acts as the baseline moral code. It's that foundational ping of truth we were just talking about.
Yes, it is the unalterable standard of truth dwelling within the individual. But a baseline code isn't enough to sustain a relationship.
Because it's just rules without the relationship part.
Exactly. That requires the U, which stands for union.
Union, okay.
This corresponds to the jar of manna, the bread from heaven that miraculously sustained the Israelites in the desert. That was also kept in the ark.
And what does that represent?
This represents daily communion. It highlights that the connection isn't a one-time event. It requires constant daily nourishment and uniting with the divine presence.
Ah, I love that. And then there's the P, which stands for perception, matching the rod of Aaron. I found the underlying logic of this part so poetic.
It really is beautiful.
Because Aaron's rod was just a dead stick of wood. But overnight, it miraculously brought forth buds, blossoms, and almonds. So the sources use this to symbolize how true union with God takes our dead, numb spiritual senses and brings them back to life.
Creating true, vibrant perception of reality.
Right, so CUP, conscience, union, perception.
It's a very elegant internal system.
Yes.
But they are equally meticulous about identifying the barriers to this system.
But things that get in the way.
Yes, they map out how this internal connection gets blocked using another acronym, which is WEB, derived from the famous parable of the sower.
Oh, the parable where a farmer throws seeds and they land on different types of ground with different results.
Right, that one.
In their WEB framework, the letters stand for will, emotion, and brain, and they break down the psychological mechanisms of each.
So in the parable, the first seeds fall on the hard beaten path and get trampled by birds. They map this to the W, the will.
Okay, so the path is your will.
Yes, the path represents the stubborn direction you actively choose to walk. If your will is hardened, if you refuse to surrender your own agenda to that lover God we discussed earlier, the seed of truth can't even penetrate the surface.
It just sits there.
It just gets crushed by your own stubbornness.
Then the E is emotion,
Right.
which matches the seed falling on rocky soil. In the story, the seed sprouts quickly but dies as soon as the sun comes out because it has no roots.
Which is very relatable.
Very. They argue this is exactly how human emotions work. You might go to an incredible music-filled Sunday service, get this massive dopamine hit of spiritual euphoria, and you sprout this visible enthusiasm.
Right, you're on a spiritual high.
But because it relies on the shallow soil of fleeting feelings rather than the deep roots of actual union in CUP, it withers the second you face a real challenge on Monday morning.
Which leaves the final and honestly most complex barrier, the B, representing the brain.
The brain.
This matches the seed that falls among the thorns. The thorns grow up and suffocate the plant. The sources argue that human logic, fueled by the anxieties, the riches, and all the complex distractions of the modern world, acts exactly like those thorns.
It just chokes everything out.
It chokes out the simple, raw reality of spiritual perception.
And this leads to an interpretation in the audio source that is completely different from anything I've ever heard in traditional theology.
It's a huge leap, yeah.
They connect these thorns directly to the crown of thorns that Jesus wore during the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Since thorns represent this suffocating, incomplete thinking of the brain, they argue that Jesus wearing the thorns on his head wasn't just physical torture. It was a profound symbol of him taking on and cleansing humanity's flawed, anxious, and incomplete intellectual frameworks.
It is a stunning piece of symbolic theology, tying the parable directly to the crucifixion like that.
It is, but I have to pause here. I really need to push back on this WB framework for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If the brain is equated to thorns that suffocate the seed, doesn't this run the risk of becoming deeply anti-intellectual? I mean, are they literally arguing that critical thinking is a weed that just needs to be pulled out so we can all walk around acting purely on mystical vibes?
That is the natural concern anytime a philosophy targets the intellect, right?
Yeah.
You immediately think, oh, this is a cult of irrationality.
Exactly.
But looking closely at the audio context, they are not attacking the capacity for reason itself. They are attacking what they describe as a fake soul or an artificial web. It's not that critical thinking is bad. It's that the human brain too easily becomes weaponized by worldly anxieties.
Oh, I see.
We build these massive artificial networks of rationalization to justify our fears, our greed, and our desire for control. That specific type of worldly logic is what traps human perception. It builds a cage.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because their entire theology revolves around protecting this delicate internal architecture, the CUP, overcoming the WEB. They view any external institutional structure that tries to mediate this relationship as an active threat.
Right. If you need a middleman, your internal system isn't functioning.
Which launches us into their explosive diagnosis of institutional religion. They essentially categorize it as a global infection.
To justify this, they lean really heavily on an interpretation of Hebrews chapter 9, which discusses the ancient Jewish temple.
What does that text say?
Well, the text notes that the outer tent, the physical holy place with all its heavy curtains, its altars, its rigid rituals, had to be completely dismantled so that the way into the true inner sanctuary could be opened.
And they apply this directly to the modern era. They argue that the physical temple of today, the institutional church building and its hierarchy, has to be conceptually destroyed. So the true new temple, which is the individual person armed with their conscience, union, and perception, can actually function.
And they take this logic to a very controversial extreme in the audio recording.
They really do.
They bring up globally famous evangelists,
Right.
specifically naming Billy Graham, and they analyzed the long-term impact of his ministry.
The critique there is incredibly harsh.
Very harsh.
They don't deny his massive historical influence at all, but they claim that his methodology was deeply flawed. Because his crusades partnered with local churches, he would send thousands of newly awakened converts straight back into traditional institutional congregation.
All right.
The speakers argue that by doing this, he was essentially delivering liberated people right back into the kingdom of Satan, putting them right back under the crushing legalism of the law of Moses.
It's a jarring assessment of such a beloved historical figure, but it tracks perfectly with their internal logic.
How so?
Well, if you believe the institution is built on a foundation of legalistic control rather than romantic surrender, then sending a newly awakened soul into that institution is exactly like installing a virus on a perfectly clean hard drive.
Wow.
In fact, they deliberately use the term malware.
Yes, spiritual malware.
They describe traditional religion as a virus that literally injects its organizational DNA into the believer. It redirects the person's spiritual resources away from internal communion with God and forces those resources to serve the preservation of the institution.
So the believer becomes an agent of the church rather than an agent of the divine.
Exactly.
They even argue that a significant portion of modern Protestantism has devolved into practicing what they call holy witchcraft.
Right, treating the divine as something to be manipulated rather than worshipped.
Exactly. They claim that people use the Bible like a book of magical incantations. Finding a specific scripture to use as a love potion to fix a relationship or a spell to get rich.
Which is a very clear, direct shot at the modern prosperity gospel.
Oh, absolutely. They say believers are using the biblical text as a knife to hold God hostage, demanding he act according to their personal desires and timelines rather than surrendering to his will.
Yeah, we have to pause here. It's worth pointing out, just to give you, the listener, a full picture of their mindset, that this anti-authoritarian stance bleeds over into their political views as well.
Yeah, we need to talk about that.
The Jesus Raw website contains some highly charged political statements. For instance, they explicitly state that they hate the Communist Party of China, though they emphasize their deep love for the Chinese people.
Right.
They also assert that Jesus despised the ruling government of his time, and that he primarily engaged with the religious leaders of his day just to confront them about their systemic abuse of the poor.
And we want to be very clear here. We are sharing those specific statements not to validate their politics or endorse their historical claims in any way, but to impartially illustrate just how holistic this worldview is.
Right, we're just reporting what's in the text.
Their rejection of systemic control isn't compartmentalized to Sunday mornings. It is an absolute, across-the-board rebellion against any authority that tries to insert itself between the individual and the truth.
It reveals a profound distrust of any system that demands compliance over conscience. It brings to mind the quote they reference from playwright George Bernard Shaw. Nothing wrong with Christianity, it's just that nobody's tried it yet.
Ouch.
Yeah, the implication is that the last 2,000 years have just been people practicing institutional management, not actual Christianity.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Think about how we treat our technology today. If you go out and buy a brand new, infinitely powerful smartphone, that device represents this raw, unmediated spiritual connection, the true pisteo.
Right, the real thing.
But instead of actually turning the phone on and accessing the world, imagine if you just sat at your desk and obsessively read the 5-page quick start manual over and over again.
Just memorizing the manual.
Right. You memorize the manual, you form study groups about the manual, you argue viciously with other people online about the correct interpretation of the manual, but you completely refuse to power on the device itself. That is exactly how they view religious literalism and church rules.
It is a brilliant illustration of how humans idolize the text while ignoring the spirit. And if we look at the psychological root cause of why people do this, the sources point to one primary driver, which is fear.
Fear.
At a psychological level, fear demands control.
Because freedom, true, unscripted spiritual freedom is terrifying.
It is entirely unpredictable. When people are terrified of that freedom, religion becomes an addiction to managing fear. Being a goody two-shoes, rigidly following all the external rules of the institution, it's a mechanism to ensure God won't send you to hell.
It provides a synthetic sense of safety.
Yes. But by trying to control God through your good works and your flawless rule following, you completely cut yourself off from experiencing true grace. You trade a dynamic romance for a sterile contract.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. If traditional organized religion is diagnosed as a deeply ingrained virus of fear and control, what happens after you uninstall the malware? The sources outline what they believe is the necessary future of faith. They call it the final reformation.
They base this concept on Hebrews 9:3, which mentions a coming time of setting things straight. They argue forcefully that the original Protestant Reformation, despite its historical fame, essentially failed to fix the core issue.
Because it just swapped one set of rulers for another. As the audio explicitly states, if a pope over the whole church is wrong, a pope over each church is worse.
That's quite a quote.
Right. They argue that creating thousands of independent churches, each run by a charismatic pastor, doesn't delete the malware. It just fragments it into thousands of mini-popes demanding control over smaller congregations.
And that is exactly where Jesus Raw positions its own philosophy. They view their framework not as a new religion, but as the necessary antivirus to this global malware.
The entire goal of this antivirus is to restore and cleanse the conscience. Going back to that CUP acronym, the conscience is that internal ping of truth. But they argue that institutional leaders actively train people to ignore that ping.
To listen to the leader instead.
Exactly. The speakers claim that modern pastors drown out the still, small voice of the divine because they themselves are addicted to a paycheck, to their pride, and to the social prestige of holding the title of pastor.
Well, the structural incentives of any institution naturally demand that the leader maintain control and dependency. That fundamentally contradicts the core goal of empowering the individual's own internal conscience.
But the audio makes a really poignant observation here. They note that leaving the traditional church is psychologically harder than quitting drugs.
I can imagine.
And that makes complete sense when you think about it. The malware is so deeply installed into a person's life. If you leave, your entire social safety net is instantly gone. You lose the Sunday potlucks, you lose your built-in friend group, you lose the comforting, clear set of rules that assure you you're a good person.
You're losing your entire world.
So if you completely uninstall the operating system of the traditional church to embrace this raw antivirus, how does a person actually navigate their spirituality? Are they just wandering entirely alone without any scaffolding?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they aren't actually advocating for total solitary isolation.
Okay, good.
What they are advocating for is a radical shift in community geometry. Instead of vertical, hierarchical organizations with a specialized pastor at the top distributing truth to the passive laity at the bottom, they propose small, horizontal circles of believers.
Oh, so it functions like a peer-to-peer network rather than everyone logging into a centralized server.
Precisely. The fundamental conviction driving this peer-to-peer model is the belief that the individual already possesses all the anointing, the access, and the knowledge they need.
Wow.
The Holy Spirit is the teacher, not the guy standing on the stage with the microphone. When you completely strip away the vertical scaffolding, you are forced to rely on your own internal CUP, your conscience, your daily union, and your renewed perception.
And you verify that internal reality in a horizontal, equal community with others who are doing the exact same thing.
Exactly.
So we've gone on quite a journey today. We started with a radical redefinition of God, rejecting the anxious ledger of an adversarial lawyer in favor of a lover trying to persuade a rebellious will.
Right.
We mapped the internal architecture of the human soul through CUP and WEB, exploring how our own stubbornness, our fleeting emotions, and our incomplete anxious thinking act like thorns suffocating our spiritual perception.
And we explored their explosive diagnosis of institutional religion as spiritual malware, a fear-based system of control masquerading as holy.
It is a framework that strips away every external excuse and demands absolute, terrifying internal accountability.
It really does. There's nowhere to hide.
So what does this all mean? We want to challenge you, the listener, to examine your own life. You don't have to agree with their theology to find the underlying psychology here incredibly piercing. Take a look at your own daily habits. What malware or incomplete thinking have you installed in your own routines?
That's a great point.
What rigid belief systems or social structures are you desperately clinging to simply because they give you a synthetic sense of control over your own fears?
This raises an important question, one that really lingers long after you finish processing these sources.
What's that?
If the ultimate purpose of this raw, unmediated connection is to elevate the quiet ping of your conscience above the deafening noise of the crowd, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. What if the truest test of any system in our lives, whether it's a religious institution, a corporate job, a political party, or a social network, isn't whether it makes us feel safe and comfortable, but whether it actively amplifies our conscience or strategically silences it.
That is a heavy, entirely necessary question to carry with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you, keep looking closely at the systems you trust, and never stop questioning the blueprints.